Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream. We actually do these live streams every week, same time, same place, Tuesdays on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. We cover things related to digital transformation, business transformation. My name is Eric Kimberly. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I'm also the host of a podcast called Transformation Ground Control. And this interview here today is going to be part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So thank you for being here today and being part of our live production of that podcast. Today's topic is integrating and standardizing operations during M&A and growth. So we're going to talk about how to integrate and standardize, consolidate operations, and really scale for growth, whether you're a larger organization that's out acquiring other companies or whether you're just going through organic growth or any other sort of business transformation. We just want to talk about what some of the challenges are with going through that sort of transformation where you're trying to integrate and standardize operations and technologies across your operations. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment, but before I do, a couple quick things. I mentioned that this is part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. You can watch that podcast, past episodes at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also subscribe on Apple Music and Spotify and any other audio podcast platform as well, or just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to see where you can listen and watch. I'd love to get any audience questions on this topic as we get into the thread here today with our guest. Any questions you have, please drop those in the chat. We're watching the chat as we go here. We're watching all the chats on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So be sure to drop any questions or comments you have in the chat. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat now. What city and country are you joining from today? I'd love to hear where you're from here today. I am based in Denver, but I am in Chicago today. So that's where I'm at, and I'll let our guest introduce herself and tell us where she's from. But in the meantime, please tell us where you're joining from today. We'd love to hear where the global community is joining us from here today. So again, today's topic is integrating and standardizing business operations during M&A and growth. And joining me is Kimberly Eubank. Kimberly, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. And I am in Atlanta today. That is where I live, and so I'm coming from you from my home office. I have spent most of my career doing transformational work. I spent almost 20 years with AT&T, and I would say that my transformation and kind of M&A journey started actually with the merger and acquisition between AT&T Wireless and Singular Wireless. I led the day one readiness for their merger integration, which at the time was the largest all-cash deal in the history of the U.S., $41 billion. And it impacted about 46 million customers. So that's kind of how my fascination with transformation began. And then I've been since then in a series of other companies, in a series of other industries, leading change and transformation. And so I've done customer service transformations, I've done digital transformations, I've done end-to-end customer journey transformations. I've been in telecom, financial services, manufacturing. So I've been around the block where transformation is concerned.
And some pretty large ones too, which I'm really excited to talk about. I mean, it sounds like you've been involved with a variety of transformations, but I'm fascinated by some of the large integrations you've been involved with. So I definitely want to jump into that here as we get into today's conversation. So before we get into some of the specific sort of examples and case studies of situations you've been involved with, maybe just tell us a little bit about when we talk about standardizing operations, what are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when they're trying to create a common operating model or trying to act like one company after they've grown through acquisition or potentially just through organic growth? A lot of times they start to act like several different companies. They have inefficiencies. They're a bit disconnected, and they look around and say, hey, we want to standardize operations. We want to act like one company, or we want to have a unified operating model. What are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when they're trying to go through that process?
I think very few companies know actually how to do that. They don't know how to standardize. They don't know how to bring the two sides together. So one of the big ones, of course, is always culture, right? Just because you purchase a company or you do a joint venture with another company doesn't mean that your cultures are going to merge and work together seamlessly without effort. So I think the cultural aspects are always at the core of any merger integration, and it's probably something that leaders don't spend enough time figuring out a game plan around. I think the other thing is just people being entrenched in the way their company did it and thinking that their way is the best, and really being open to redefining the process for the betterment of both of the organizations. Because the reality is there's probably some good stuff on both sides, and you have the opportunity to, you have a blank sheet of paper, you have the opportunity to really look at this and make it world class across both entities. But if you're entrenched in the way your company's done it, or all of the corner cases, I think sometimes we get lost in corner cases as well. Instead of taking care of the 90%, we're focused on the 2 or 3% of the corner cases that, oh, you can't do that because, right? So those are some of the common pitfalls that I see.
Tell us about the corner cases. Are those is another way to frame that? Are those the squeaky wheels, or the way things have always been, so therefore we don't want to change? Is that sort of what you mean by the corner cases?
The exceptions to the rule, right? So 95% of the customers flow through this one way, but you have this really weird customer type or situation where you sell to something that's completely different from everything else. And so you've created your own kind of kludgy process to handle that, or you've put in a lot of custom automation to handle those types of use cases. And so, instead of evolving the 95 or the 97% of the customers, you kind of have stayed static because of that 3% of the customers that are, quite frankly, holding you back. And the reality is you can do both, but you just have to be open to reimagining the both sides of that, the 3% and the 97%.
Yeah. Why, when companies are growing or scaling for growth, either again through acquisition or organic growth, why is standardization so important? I guess if we just back up even more.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to scale gracefully if you're like most companies, most startup companies. Most startup companies are doing things through sheer brute force, right? They didn't have the automations in place. They maybe didn't have the talent to even know they needed the automations in place. They grew kind of organically over time, and often you get out in front of your skis, right? And your growth starts surpassing your ability to handle the day-to-day operations. And so what I find when I go into those companies is there's a lot of things still being done manually, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of people. I had an old CEO at a company calling it sneaker net, right? That people just walk from desk to desk to desk to get things done, even in this day and age. And so that's just not something that you can scale gracefully. And so one of the things when I go in and do an assessment of a company that I like to ask people as I'm doing the interviews is, okay, so your company has to triple in size in 3 years or 5 years or whatever the goal is, assuming you're not going to get more people, right? Because we're not going to put more hamsters on the wheel, right? Assuming that you're not going to get more people, what things have to be fixed or automated or reinvented in order for you to handle 3 times the work with the same number of people? And when you phrase it like that, then people start to open up a bit about, oh, well, if you ask me like that, then if you're not going to give me 5 more people to keep doing this manually, then I would need help with this thing and this thing and this thing.
Right. Yeah. It makes total sense. And then some of those inefficiencies that you build because you can get away with it when you're smaller, they start to multiply, and suddenly you look around and you see that, wow, we're not only highly inefficient, but our customers are experiencing not disruptions necessarily, but a disconnect in our brand and a disconnect in the way we operate and a disconnect in the experience they get from operating with, different parts of the organization. So it seems like I can see how that would start to add up over time.
When you start to create your own monster. I mean, I had a company that I worked with that their tax exemption process was very manual, right? And so they ended up having to do a ton of workarounds. Well, we can't send this email that has taxes in it because the customer might not be, actually supposed to be taxed. So we need to have a way to hold that email in the case where the tax exemption status hasn't finalized yet, and that builds and that builds and that builds, and then as you're building even new things, you have to keep remembering all those workarounds that you put in place for very valid reasons at the time. There's always a reason. There's always a reason why something has been done the way it's done. But the reality is sometimes the time for that has passed, and you just have to kind of say you did your service. You did what you were supposed to do for the time that you were there, but it's time to move on and move past that way of doing things.
Right. Right. So you talked a little bit about culture and what a big challenge culture can be when standardizing operations. And I know you've shared with me in the past some metrics around M&A integrations and the dismal success rates, or in other words, the high failure rates of M&A integration. What are some of the, I know culture is probably one of them, but what are some of the main reasons why M&A integrations fail when there's a merger or an acquisition and companies are trying to come together as one? What are some of the biggest reasons that they fail?
Yeah, I mean, culture is a big one. I think not actually having a plan on how you're actually going to fully execute it. So I was taught to do M&A at AT&T, right? And so a Fortune 10 company, they had kind of a science about it, and so they were very aggressive about pulling the band-aids off quickly, right? So making sure that your org structure is defined before people are supposed to start, acting like one company, right? So I think taking too long to get your org structure together so that people know who they're supposed to be taking direction from. Making sure that from a leadership perspective, you have clearly communicated what that North Star is so that people know that on day one of being a combined entity, that they know what they're supposed to be going and doing. Because if you don't give them that clear direction, then they're going to just keep doing what they've always done because no one's told them to do anything different. And
Hmm.
so I think whether it's an M&A or whether it's just your own company needing to digitally transform, and in my consultancy, I've kind of come up with a clear, ready, and aligned as three pillars that you need to do before you start spending money, before you start, buying things, to make sure that you're clear on why you're doing it and what you want to be when you grow up, to make sure that your organization is ready culturally and skill set wise, right? If you have brought together two companies who have been keeping their lights on in the technical space for the last 10 years, and now you're looking at, oh crap, we have to integrate all this stuff, we have to rethink processes, we have to drive for completion dates, you probably don't have this mindset or the skill set on your teams to do that, right? Because it has been very much status quo in those both of those organizations for the last 10 years. So I think just taking the time to set yourself up for success, making sure leadership is aligned around where you're going and how to get their teams there, that they're advocating for the changes in the same voice. I mean, making sure that your leadership team is really singing off the same sheet of music is important, because you can't, I talk about, being aligned at 50,000 feet is very different than being aligned at 500 feet. And I've seen so often in transformations or merger integrations where people nod their head at 50,000 feet because it's mom and apple pie. Yeah, sure. We got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. But I think in the back of their heads, a lot of them are like, well, that's everybody else has got to change. My organization doesn't have to change. How my team does work doesn't have to change. And then there's going to come a time when their team does need to change. And then you start to see the friction, right? Because they really weren't aligned at that lower level of granularity. So I think all of those things play a part. Um, but culture absolutely can eat strategy. All the time. You can have the best laid plan, but if your culture isn't conducive to working together and bringing things together, it very quickly can sabotage your efforts, which can cost you a lot of money in the end of the day.
Yeah. And culture is so hard to see and touch and feel. You can look at an operating model and say, okay, those are two different business processes or two different ways of operating, or you can look at an org structure and say, okay, that is or that isn't what we want. It's pretty fairly tangible. Systems, same thing. You can look at the technology that's being used. You can sort of see it black and white, for better or for worse. But culture is a lot harder to describe and quantify and get your arms around. How have you seen organizations sort of get their arms around two different cultures or multiple cultures if they're going to potentially acquire or integrate with another company?
Well, I mean, I've seen it done a lot of different ways, some to more success than others. I think, again, going back to my days at AT&T, they literally, if you're a sci-fi fan, we used to say we are the Borg, we will be assimilated, because they had a leadership development track that they put us through, called Leading with Distinction. And every single year you went to Leading with Distinction, and they picked a theme, whether it was innovation, where they talked about, we want to innovate, we want to fail fast, resilience, right? There's a lot of change. How to be resilient with the change. There's a different theme kind of every year. And they put all the different levels of the organization through what we, colloquially were like an indoctrination program, right? To make sure that we understood what those pillars that they wanted us to be. And I think I worked with a company recently that had what they called a from to model. Here are our current behaviors, and we want to go from this to these new behaviors, right? And so, however you phrase it, I think you as a leadership team really have to come out with these are the behaviors that we want you to perform to going forward, and to manage your teams to going forward. So I've seen that, and during that program, actually one of the consultants that came in to do that program said it takes 7 years to change a culture, to really change a culture. And
Yeah.
and I believe that. Now, do I think a transformation or M&A can take 7 years? Absolutely not. You got to get your technology and all of your synergies from the purchase. You have to have that way under 7 years. But supposedly 7 years to change a culture. I've seen other organizations go at it very methodically, but very slowly, layer by layer by layer. Like year one, we'll work on the executive team and make sure they're aligned, and then year two, we'll work on the VP level, and then year three, we'll work on the director level. That to me takes too long. I've had other companies that haven't worked on it at all. They just thought it was magically going to happen, right? And that doesn't work. Spoiler alert. Um, and then I've had others that I think that they thought, well, if we just show them with the technology and whatever, people will just get it. They'll just, they'll figure it out as they go. I think the biggest thing that you have to do, though, whatever model you pick, is you have to have accountability around the two behaviors, right? Once you define what from and to is, then you need to hold people accountable to the twos. And if you start seeing them regress back to their from behaviors, you got to call them on it. And that's where I see leaders not really sticking with the program, right? Because it's easier to let people just be what they've always been. And so sometimes, there's a little dust up when you're holding people accountable to the two. But I think accountability is a huge part of cultural change. And it doesn't have to be rough. It just has to be, in a meeting when it's not being conducted in the two manner, right? Just saying, hey, part of our from twos is we're supposed to be thinking about this way. Are we really doing that here? Like, maybe we should take a step back, right? So there's ways to do it that are non-confrontational, but the repetition, just like a child watching, their cartoons, they have to watch it, a million times to get the concept. Adults need that repetition as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you come back to those three pillars you mentioned before? I think you said clarity, readiness, and alignment. Were those the three?
Clear, ready, aligned. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe unpack those a little bit more, just each of those three? And I also want to ask you a follow-up on why it sounds, so far from what I understand about it, it sounds fairly intuitive, but it sounds like it's not intuitive in terms of how organizations approach M&A. But maybe explain the three first, and let's come back to why organizations don't follow this approach.
Yeah. So clear is kind of assessing your future state, your current state, your motivation. Why do you want to do this, right? I worked with a client one time who, I honestly feel like they were doing a transformation because everybody else in their industry was doing a transformation, and they felt like that was just the thing they needed to do, right? And they didn't have a clear line of sight to what they wanted to be or what they were trying to get out of it. And so when you don't have that clarity of why you're doing it and what you're going to be when you come out, you're not going to be able to articulate that clearly to your workforce, and therefore you're not going to be able to get the buy-in. I think the other thing that the clear pillar does is it talks about vulnerabilities and feasibility, right? You could know that your business needs this, but is it feasible that your company can do it? Can what are the roadblocks that would stand in your way from a leadership perspective? So clarity is just kind of a double click. Most companies can pass that pillar decently, but I have seen some that really struggle to be like, well, everybody else is doing it. I just assumed I needed to do it too. And then when you get to readiness, that really talks about the cultural piece of it. Is the mindset of your employees, do they believe they need to change? Have you made that case to say, look, if we don't change, this is the bad outcome that's going to happen, right? We can't continue to just be what we've always been. That's off the table, right? So something has to change, and here's why. Also, the what's in it for me, right? The skill sets, right? So I talked about, if you've had a maintenance organization for the last 10, 15 years, it is unlikely that you have the innovation and the drive skill sets to actually undertake a transformation internal to yourselves and be able to accomplish that with any degree of speed and efficiency. Budget. Can you afford this, right? Because transformation costs money. And so you might want it and desire it, but if you can't earmark several $1,000,000 to it, then you're probably not going to be able to do a transformation. You might be able to select certain improvements that you can go do and make those incremental, and they may have big impact, but don't go out with a talk track that says it's a transformation, because it's not. You're going to be doing pocketed solutions. So those types of things are the things that you talk about. Commitment and patience are two other things in that track. And that's really focused at senior leadership, right? Are they committed to making the hard decisions, right? Because the reality is some people probably are going to have to exit during a transformation, right? Or during an M&A. There's going to be somebody that doesn't want to get on the change train, right? And those people, sometimes you can move them into roles where they're less, impactful to the change. But other times, they're a little toxic to the environment that you're trying to create, the new culture, and you may have to exit them, or they may vote themselves off the island. Either one of those things, right? And then patience, and that's the thing that I see senior leadership struggle with a lot. So when you're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars, you want to see the shiny, sexy thing at the end that you can tout and that you can talk about to employees and customers. But the reality is, M&A and transformation is a heck of a lot of integration work. It's cleaning your data. It's getting your plumbing and your electrical in line, because you don't want to be doing fancy things and displaying things to customers that isn't accurate or isn't timely, or it's not showing the right answer. And so as a result of that, the first year or two can actually be very much behind the curtain. And it's not sexy and it's not exciting, but it's very critical to getting all the other stuff right. You're building your foundation. And so I've seen senior leaders really struggle with the patience, because they're like, but I gave you $10 million. What have you done with it? And if they can't see it and touch it and feel it, they have a very difficult time understanding this is a building block, right? And you got to let us do it sequentially, and you got to let us get to the building block. And then the last pillar, which is alignment, is really about making sure that you're aligned at less than that 50,000 foot view, right? And so it's making sure that you have the advocacy, that the leadership team are going to sing off that same sheet of music, that there's not conflict, right? Goal misalignment is huge. So if you've had a maintenance organization, I'll just use an IT organization. If you've had an IT organization who's been treated as a maintenance organization for the last decade, and all you've been pushing on them is cost control, cost control, cost control, there is going to be an inherent conflict between innovating and driving new solutions and cost containment. Those two are usually mutually exclusive. So all of those types of things are things that people jump into transformation, but they don't think about those, what I call the 13 competencies. They don't think about how their organization lines up with each of those competencies. And the reality is, if you can identify that you're going to have a rub there, or you can even address the rub before it happens, it's going to help with your efficiency and your speed and your buy-in. It's going to help you go faster and actually spend less money because you're able to go more smoothly and you're able to go faster. And a lot of companies just dive in and are like, yep, we're doing this, let's go. And then those things that were foreseeable and addressable end up biting them in the patootie, because they didn't think about them ahead of time.
I had a guest on here a couple years ago on this podcast, and she was a PhD, and she had studied a lot of psychology in addition to business and stuff that we talk about on this show. But one of the things she brought up that has really stuck with me is this concept of action bias, and how we as humans are wired to take action. So we're not wired to do the things you just described. We're not wired to make sure that things are clear and make sure we're aligned before we jump ahead. We're aligned. We're wired to do what you just described. Let's jump in. Let's go, because we have that action bias. And so I think that's a super interesting dynamic that I think actually haunts a lot of transformations, because we want to we have the right intentions in mind, because we want to get stuff done. We want to make it successful. But in doing so, we sort of run the wrong direction. You know, we don't have the map. We don't have a blueprint for what it is we're trying to accomplish.
I mean, the old adage of proper planning prevents poor performance. Yeah, I mean, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question from Darian on LinkedIn, and Darian asks, what are some of the biggest change management and people challenges with integration and standardization? I know you talked about them maybe being stuck in the from and not focused enough on the to be. Is there anything else that you see from a people perspective that you think are some of the biggest challenges you've seen when trying to integrate operations?
I think it's the accountability. Accountability to actually, hold people to that. This is the new way forward. You can't regress. You can't go back. We're not going to do that. I worked with a company that every time something new was released, if there was any noise about the change, no matter how small the pocket of people were, right, energy and attention was given to that noise that kind of stopped everything in the tracks, because you had to go deal with that noise. And I'm not saying ignore people's concerns, because there might actually be real post-production issues that you needed to address. But doing that in a way that is, okay, well, the change is happening. Like, we're not going to go back, but let's work through your specific issue. How you react to that as a leadership team is critical, because if you're constantly, oh, wait, do we need to pull that back? It's not perfect, right? If you constantly have that, then you're sending a signal to your team that maybe this change is optional. And maybe if I raise my hand enough and I'm a squeaky enough wheel, they'll just stop doing this and they'll go back to the way that they've done it before. So I think being committed to the forward plan, articulating that, realizing that 100% of the people are not going to be happy. They're not, because they liked the way they did it. And your job is not trying to make 100% of the people happy, right? It's trying to make, the 90% happier and make the experience better. And then holding folks accountable to the changes and the mindset around their change and their behaviors around the change, right? So, I literally was putting in a CRM suite, right? And there's different modules in the suite, some focused toward customer service, some focused toward sales, etc. And we had gone through the requirements gathering, and we'd put together the plan on the sales module. And it really came down to, they were having budget constraints. And so it really came down to me actually saying, look, behaviors have to change. If you spend this money and you make these changes, you have to lead your sales force differently. And so if you're not willing to lead your sales force differently, then you should not do this project and you should defer it. because you will be wasting money and people will not be happy with the change because you're leading them one way and the system is directing them a different way, because the system was going to be put in place was going to have more data integrity, and so that we could automate things and things like that. And so you can't be quite as mushy in your processes if you're trying to automate and expose data and those types of things. And in the end, they decided that they weren't ready to change how they led their people in the sales organization. And as a result, we deferred the project and they did not spend the $250,000 that it would have taken to make the change. And for them, that was probably the right decision, because I don't think that they were culturally ready for it. And I don't think that they were culturally committed to the level of organizational change that they were going to need to make the most of that module's functionality.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if we back up even more and look at, before you jump in and actually move forward with a merger or a decision to combine entities, you want to make sure that you see a path of how you might make it succeed. And this is an interesting question from Eduardo on LinkedIn. And he says, how does the leadership team know how fit an organization is for a merger? So if we sort of look at the pre-integration work that needs to get done in terms of the assessment and really doing the due diligence behind it, is this a good fit? Should we be merging companies here? Have you seen that side of it? And do you have any advice for organizations that are maybe thinking about or contemplating a merger?
Yeah, what I've seen is they talk about the product synergies. They talk about, filling white space and in the acquiring party's portfolio. They'll even really will look at the leadership team, the C-suite, and be like, can we work together?
Right.
What I've never seen them do, and I'm not saying that no one's done it, I've just never seen it, is I've never seen them talk about how work gets done. How do you guys do work? How do you tackle a problem? How do you make change, or do you make change, right? How do you finance work, right? Like one company could be like gut feel, yeah, we need to go do that. Give them, $500,000. That's great. Another may have a very structured business case process, right? So I think that's where I wish they maybe would double click a little bit more, is how do the teams actually interact all day long and how do they get work? Because I can tell a couple things from a company. If your IT is reporting into your CFO, that to me is a sign you are probably a maintenance organization. You are not an innovation organization if you are reporting to a CFO. And I know that's a very European thing, that they have a lot of IT organizations reporting into CFOs. It's not my favorite model. The other thing is, when I go in to consult with somebody, I ask them for an email so that I can see people's calendars, so that I can just move meetings around more easily without having to go through a third party to do that. And if I walk into an organization and I have no trouble booking the meetings I need because everybody's calendar is wide open, I can tell you right now that they're not talking to each other enough, right? Yeah. They're not having cross-functional conversations enough if their calendar only has 2 meetings a day on it. And I've seen that at a couple of companies, and I was correct both times. Like they were not talking to each other. Everybody was doing their own thing in a silo. Yeah. So I would really, really, really like people to spend more time figuring out how organizations get work done on the regular, because that's going to tell them a lot about how seamlessly the two are they problem solvers or are they band-aiders?
Yeah.
You fix things at root cause, or do you just, slap a band-aid on it?
That's a really interesting data point, and it makes total sense. I've just never heard anyone say that. As far as like if there's not enough meetings, or if there's too few meetings, it means you're not collaborating. Because I think we get so obsessed with let's cut meetings. We've got too much bureaucracy. Let's get meetings off our plates. So to hear someone say maybe you should be meeting more because you should be collaborating more, that's such a not counterintuitive, but it goes against the grain of what.
Oh no, it is a contrarian opinion, but because everybody is like, oh no, too many meetings. Yeah, there's too many useless meetings.
Right.
But nobody's complaining if it is a productive meeting. And I grew up on conference calls, not even video calls, conference calls, right? Because we were a globally dispersed company and even a US dispersed company. So this whole talk track of you can't have a productive meeting remotely or over the phone or over video, I don't buy it because it's been my entire career.
Yeah. I mean,
Accomplished some pretty big things doing it that way. So I
you
know
do
it's
have to talk. You do have to collaborate. I mean, meetings are okay. But you're right. If they're ineffective, if you're just having a meeting because you're supposed to have the meeting without any real purpose, then of course that's a different story. But
and I literally was at a company where there was a meeting that they had, I think once a month or something, and like 100 people would come on the meeting and nobody ever said anything. No one ever asked any questions. And I'm like, number one, I don't understand why there's 100 people on this meeting because they're not interacting. They don't care. But it was literally, well, it's on my calendar. I'm supposed to go to it. And I canceled that meeting because I took over the team and I canceled the meeting. Not one single person was like, oh, where'd my meeting go? None of them cared.
right,
Yeah,
right, didn't miss it.
didn't miss it.
So what's the most difficult integration you've ever been involved with? I know you've done this a lot through your career, going back to AT&T, and you've done it quite a few times since then. But could you describe a case study or a use case of the most difficult one you've been involved with?
I mean, different ones are different or are difficult for different reasons. So at AT&T was really the merger examples, and to be honest, they know what they're doing, right? The hardest part about the AT&T and Singular merger at the time was, so if we remember, Bell South and Southwestern Bell owned Singular. They actually bought AT&T Wireless, and so then AT&T Wireless became Singular. So the AT&T that you know today is not the original AT&T. We absorbed the original AT&T and then took their name. And so that was hard because they were both public companies, because they were both in the top 3 carriers. There was a lot of FCC and Justice Department scrutiny before the merger was approved. And there's a lot of rules around those kind of mergers, right? So we were not allowed to plan with the other party directly without parlor rooms and attorneys present because we were still competitors until that merger happened. And we were both of significant size. So it was not going to go under the radar if we were talking to each other and behaving as anything other than competitors. And we couldn't have attorneys every minute of every day to be there. So the hard part of that one was we pretty much planned that in the dark. And where you had key like interfaces that you needed to build and things like that, yes, then we would set up a parlor room and we would have a conversation. But for the most part, the Singular side of the house defined the strategy, decided what needed to be done, guessed as well as we could, looked at publicly available information, called the 800 number, whatever we could do to get the information. But we planned that puppy in the dark. And then we only had 30 days to execute it once the merger closed. So that was hard just because of the constraints put on us, but it was easy because when we had the clear, ready, and aligned like competencies, we were firing on all cylinders. And so while it was a hard thing to do, it actually was one of the easier projects to run. The ones that are hard for me personally are the ones where you can't get out of your own way. And I've had a couple of those where, one that I worked on, they wanted to do the stuff in-house. They wanted to do the IT stuff in-house, but the IT organization was just not capable of doing it in-house, but they were insistent on doing it in-house. And as a result, things were just not going as fast as it needed to go. We were burning money. And it ended up being we're not where we should be on the plan. And so then, IT got defensive about scope, and the business was like, it's not a scope problem, it's a productivity problem. And so then you end up having a bunch of infighting. And that's just where the company literally they should have hired SIs, hindsight 2020, they should have hired external SIs to just work the project. And that one would have been much easier. And then I've had another one where culture culture got in the way. The technical things were accomplished, but I have no doubt that if you go back and visit that company 5 years from now, because the cultural aspect didn't really click, I think that it was just a moment in time where they were brought up to date technically, but I think they're gonna continue to go back to what they've always been, and that's disheartening. So it's not hard; it's hard to watch it. It's
Right.
hard to know how the story's gonna end. And so those for me are the ones that are the hardest. When I know you could be more, I know you could do more, and for whatever reason, you're in your own way.
Right. Right. What about you started to touch on this, and so this is a timely question from YouTube. In the context of M&A, what are the best practices for achieving data consistency and integrity while merging disparate ERP systems? And how can one standardize operations post-merger? Big question, very broad question, but let's focus on the technology piece because you were just sort of touching on that a moment ago. What are some of the just high-level general best practices for how you bring technology together and how you standardize technology and data across multiple entities when you're trying to go through that sort of merger?
Yeah, so I'll go back to AT&T. So AT&T at one point, the singular side of AT&T. So before the AT&T merger, it was singular, right? So it was the joint venture between Bell South and Southwestern Bell. And Bell South, when they had purchased entities, they integrated them within a couple of years. And so they ended up having all of their properties on one billing system, which in manufacturing, call it an ERP, but in telecom, we called it a biller or billing system. They had one. The Southwestern Bell side of the family had taken a completely different approach, and they had not integrated anything. And so when they kept acquiring, if you guys remember the cellular ones, right? There'd be a cellular one of Indianapolis and a cellular one of Chicago and a cellular one of Poughkeepsie. When they brought those into their fold, they didn't do any integrations. So when we became one and tried to form singular, there was something like 12 billing systems that we had to get down to one billing system.
Wow.
And so when I say data mapping, data mapping, data mapping, data mapping, and more data mapping, I mean, that may seem so basic and old school, and there's probably a lot more modern ways to accomplish that. But really understanding the core elements of your data that you need to do business, right? Because 90% of it's going to be the same things. And then you've got to sit down and you got to decide on definitions, right? So even two people using the same ERP could be using fields in that ERP differently. And that's what I've found is the hardest part, because especially when you get down into small to mid-sized businesses, I'm gonna go to Vegas on your documentation is not up to sniff test, right? And so you're really relying on people's memories of, well, why did we do that? And how do we use that field? And does one department use that field differently than another department? And you don't even know it, right? And so it's tedious. There's no silver bullet for it. You've just got to sit down and you got to go through the data maps and you've got to talk about the data and you've got to decide on what your target data mapping is going to be, like what is, and then you've got to sit there and you've got to map everything across, and you'll have to take those cases that, well, I use this field for that, well, I use that field for that, and you'll have to have that conversation and decide. So it's not fun. I mean, I guess some data-oriented people might consider that to be fun.
Some might disagree with you,
right? Like, but it's almost like forensic accounting on your ERP. And by the way, that isn't even in an M&A situation. That's just, you could have that same thing going from on-premise to cloud.
Right. Just a
right?
general migration.
Yeah, because I mean, a company that I worked with recently, had 15 years of just customization on top of customization on top of customization, and they're staring down going to the cloud over the course of the next year. And it does put some fear in your boots because you don't really know what's under the covers. So you just got to peel those layers of the onions one by one. So I don't know that I gave you a silver bullet on how to do that, but yeah, it's a lot of work, and it's detailed work, but it's so important. It's so important.
Yeah, I was looking for not only a silver bullet, but an easy button, but it sounds like you're not here to offer that up for
No,
us.
no, no.
It makes total sense. And you're right. A lot of what you're talking about, is not sexy. And you mentioned that earlier. A lot of this stuff is not sexy. It's a lot of behind the scenes grunt work, for lack of a better word, but it has to be done. And it's what's ultimately going to make it
Now,
successful.
what I am seeing though is I am seeing companies come out that are actually, they've built the integration for you, right? So there'll be a company that you can actually purchase their software to help you get from on-premise to cloud, or to get from one ERP to another ERP. So that's something that, back in the day, you would have had to have built that all yourself. And so now people are commercializing that and making it repeatable. And so you still have to do the work to do the mappings, but the transfer over, I think there are companies out there specializing in that to make that a little simpler and seamless for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. There's a question I want to elaborate. I'm going to change the question a little bit just to broaden it a little bit, but because I think it's a really good question that applies to multiple areas. This is from William on YouTube. William says a large M&A will have a host of layoffs due to redundancy, et cetera. How do you determine who stays and who goes? Do you defer to the acquiring company? And actually, why don't I broaden that? Just talk about people and technology. When you look at what people are going to stay or go, and what technologies or systems are going to stay or go, or how are you going to address technology? What's the sort of the pecking order or the hierarchy of how that typically works, or where you've seen it be most successful in terms of who determines what people, what technologies are going to stay or go?
Yeah. So in the technology space, I have typically seen that to be acquiring companies' tech is probably going to win unless they're not happy with their solution.
Hmm.
So let's say they're a Salesforce house. You're probably going to Salesforce, right? But let's say that their ERP, they don't like their ERP, or they're having issues with their ERP, or their ERP is on premise and your ERP is already in the cloud. In that case, they, if they're doing it the way they should be doing it, then they're looking at it and going, oh, well, actually, instead of bringing them over to on-premise and then having to take both of us to cloud later, let's just us go to cloud and go to your ERP and get it over in one fell swoop, right? So on technology, I have typically found that the acquiring companies' technology will win, just because it's in place. And it's working. As long as it's working for them and it's already integrated into everything else, it's just one less thing that they have to deal with. On the people side, there's going to be as many different flavors of this as the companies that undertake it. Yes, there will be redundancy. Yes, you don't need two people doing the same job. I have seen some companies, though, keep both sets of people for a long time because they're afraid that the historical knowledge isn't going to transfer. So they're afraid, and it's something legitimate that you should be concerned about. There's a lot of tribal knowledge that's in people's heads. It's not all going to be documented. And so I wouldn't be doing a mass cut 6 months in, right? I probably would wait a year to let people commingle and learn about each other. And then you've seen, number one, you've seen how they work. You see if they're on board with the new situation, and you can make specific recommendations, specific to the people for that particular job. I will say that what I would do quickly is everybody has low performers. Everybody has people in their organization that they're like, oh my gosh, like I don't have enough to exit them. Like they're doing just the bare minimum to stay above that line. So I don't have enough to exit them, but I also don't have the leeway to offer them a package, right? Right when you merge, that's the time to try and get those folks out, right? Because you can offer some RIFs, some reduction in force packages, and you can target those people that you as a boss may have already had on your radar. They weren't adding value to one company, so the odds that they're going to be adding value to the combined company probably isn't high either. But for people who are contributing and are, going along with the plan, I would keep them a little bit longer, and I would build that into the business case, right?
Mm.
To keep that a little bit longer. Now, where you can't do that is at senior leadership levels. You can't have two dueling senior vice presidents of the same thing. You can't have two dueling VPs of the same thing, right? But at the senior manager level, you can disperse the work. Well, you have this part of branding and you have this part of branding, or however you want to do it. But you do have to have a clear organizational structure. And so the other thing that I think AT&T did very well was every time they merged in, before the date of the merger happened or within a week of the merger closing, you had an organizational structure that said, this is how, this is who's going to own what. And they sorted that very quickly. And then it was up to those folks to sort their organizations accordingly. And that takes a minute. That takes a minute.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, what about getting started? Here's a question from Darian, which is a good sort of capstone question here to tie this all together and bring together all the threads you've talked about so far, Kimberly. But what advice do you have for businesses beginning a digital or business transformation or an integration effort? Let's just broaden that a little bit to talk about, specifically around integration or any sort of M&A integration, or they're trying to standardize. How do you get started? I imagine you probably come back to those three tenets that you started with, but how would you summarize that for us?
Yeah, well, you can call me and I'll help you. But so what I do is, if it's me, I will go in and I actually do extensive interviews, and I do it around the clear, ready, and aligned pillars. And so I start by listening. I mean, it's tried and true, right? It's road tested. Listening is your best friend there, right? And so the last engagement that I did, I interviewed 58 people. So 58 hours of interviews out of a 500-person company, right? So I went in and I really talked to them, and it's not a lot of questions, right? But it's questions that get them to open up about the challenges. I mentioned one earlier, right? Well, if your work had to double or triple and you weren't going to get more people, what do I need to help you fix? And so that really helps you get an independent third party's view of kind of what your challenges are. Because I have seen time and again where leadership thinks they know what's going on, but they don't really know what's going on. And I've had CEO after CEO tell me, when you get the CEO job, nobody tells you the truth anymore. And you just have to know that as part of being a CEO, you're not getting the unadulterated truth from anybody anymore. And so even though you think you know what's going on, you probably don't. And so I like to talk to the people actually doing the work. And then that allows me, because they know what's broken. They know where the bodies are buried. They know these things. But either nobody's asked them, or when they've tried to bring it up in the past, no one's listened and done anything about it. And so that's where I always start. I always start with interviews, and I go through my clear, ready, and aligned assessment, and I'll give you a scorecard at the end that kind of says where you are on those scorecards. Truth is a scarce commodity. It is. It's a scarce commodity, absolutely. I really want to know kind of what they think the situation on the ground is. And then I give a readout back to whoever the executive sponsor was that brought me in to say, look, this is what I'm hearing. This is what's going on. And then I put together a roadmap that says, based on where you've told me you want to be, and based on where I'm hearing you are, and based on the challenges that your teams have, if I were going to lead this is how I would go, and this is where I think you should tackle it. And you may have different pillars that you need to tackle on, and then that kind of gives you a roadmap, and that'll tell you like how far away from your bogey are you, and how much is this going to cost, right? I mean, I'm not going to go and do a full business case based on just those interviews, right? But you can kind of tell, do you have 10 things to take care of, or do you have 3 things to take care of, right? The more things you have to take care of, the more it's going to cost.
Right.
But again, just getting that unbiased view of this is where our organization is, and not having rose-colored glasses about the situation, that's where I would always recommend everyone start.
Yeah, you're going to discover that at some point anyway. You might as well discover that as early on as possible so you have a realistic plan of how you're going to tackle those challenges.
Yep.
So great stuff. Well, what are the best ways for people to connect with you if they want to just stay in touch with you, learn more from you? What are the best ways to connect?
Yeah, you can actually find me on LinkedIn, Kimberly Eubank. But then you also can, if you want to have a conversation with me, you can reach out at kimberlyeubank.com, my website, and just submit a contact form, and you can set some time on my calendar and we can have a conversation.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you for being here today. This is super interesting, Kimberly. Appreciate you sharing your experience. And this has been a topic that's always, it's sort of like underlying a lot of the work we do. But usually when clients come to us, they're coming to us from the context of digital transformation. And then you peel back the onion and realize, oh, you're actually trying to merge, you're trying to integrate your operations, or you're trying to standardize, and you went through a merger. And that's why. So this is really helpful to kind of get it from the perspective of more of a pure business perspective, which I appreciate. So I thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and hopefully it was helpful to folks.
Absolutely. And thank you to the audience for being here today. Appreciate you all being here. You can find this interview. We'll edit it up. It will add more content to it. We'll make it part of our formal Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that gets released actually next week, next Wednesday. So go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to keep an eye out for that. You can also see all the past episodes we've ever done at that same website, transformationgroundcontrol.com. We do these live streams regarding digital and business transformations every Tuesday, same time, same place, whatever platform you're listening or watching today. We'll do it at the same place next week, same time. So I appreciate you being here today. Keep an eye out for the next episode coming up, and hope you all have a great week in the meantime, and we'll